This program is designed to have a lineup of a few different speakers from our staff sharing different perspectives about the context of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and to really start to explore some of the really deep questions at the root of the battle and its overall meaning to American history and to us today. Fredericksburg is, as many of you know, perhaps all of you know, a winter campaign that ends in a disastrous defeat for the Union Army. We usually, when we talk about context, a lot of the times you'll see historians will, especially when it comes to a battle, right? We're going to start listing the battles that come before, the battles that come after, very standard practice. And then we'll probably add in a few political occurrences, some happenings to talk about, what else is kind of going on in the mix there. But tonight we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive and share a few different stories that maybe you wouldn't traditionally associate with the Battle of Fredericksburg, and especially related to themes of emancipation. And so we're going to hear from, again, a few different speakers, both from our staff, and we have a special guest speaker, Molly Lucas Green, who's going to share some of her personal family perspective. And overall, it's going to be, I think, a very exciting evening. So thank you all again so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian to get us going.
Hi everyone. As Beth was saying, thanks so much for coming out to help kickstart the anniversary. I'm gonna move the mic up just a little bit because I'm a smidge taller than Beth. That's okay. So yeah, as Beth was saying, of course we're talking about a December of 1862 battle that takes place and transforms this town in so many ways. And yet it's so important to know that the war had already come to Fredericksburg. The Battle of Fredericksburg is not the first time the armies come here. And in the case of the United States Army, they had already been here in the summer of 1862. And from the beginning of the war, both sides understood that Fredericksburg was going to be in the crosshairs of these gigantic conflicts. Jefferson Davis himself, the president of the Confederacy, in a visit to the town in March of 1862, says to the people, "Your town is right in the wrong spot." And so the president of the Confederacy recognizes what's going to happen. With the two warring capitals being equidistant from Fredericksburg, it's just a matter of time before the two sides begin to fight over Fredericksburg. And in April of 1862, just a month after Jefferson Davis said those words, that happens. 30,000 United States soldiers arrive in Fredericksburg as part of the overall spring of 1862 campaign. They were known as the Department of the Rappahannock, and the idea was, as the main Federal Army came up the Virginia Peninsula to attack Richmond from beneath, the Department of the Rappahannock would come from Fredericksburg down beneath, and the two of them would pincer each other in between. And in the days leading up to the arrival of the United States Army in Fredericksburg, the people of the town were increasingly worried and anxious and on edge. John Washington, who was enslaved in Fredericksburg, wrote later in life, "Their outrages and dastardly acts towards the colored people of Fredericksburg cannot be told. It became dangerous to be out at all at nighttime." And so in this kind of creeping attitude of the arrival of the Army, the U.S. Army arrives on Good Friday, 1862, the middle of April. And immediately there is this mass exodus of people, of enslaved people who flee to Union lines, who see the U.S. Army as perhaps their one and only chance to escape bondage. John Washington, whose quote I just said, flees to Union lines the very first day. Sally Forbes, who lived at Fall Hill, for which Fall Hill Avenue is named, wrote in a letter to a friend, she said, "On Good Friday, every servant we had," of course she's talking about enslaved people, "on Good Friday, every servant we had left us, and we have never heard from them since, except they're waiting for the soldiers." And the U.S. Army arrives, and they spend the next 4 months here, from April through August of 1862. And it is a transformative experience, not just for the enslaved fleeing to freedom, but for the U.S. soldiers who are here in town. The photograph behind me is of a group of soldiers from Company I of the 7th Wisconsin Infantry. If you look closely in the background, you can see the Fredericksburg city skyline. The churches of the town are in the distance. Soldiers from Wisconsin, it is not far-fetched to imagine, had never even seen an African American or a person of color. If you look at the demographics of the state of Wisconsin in 1860, it is a minuscule proportion of the state. And yet these soldiers and soldiers like them immediately come into the stark reality of not only a war for union, but a war for emancipation. And so I want to take a few minutes just to quote some of them as part of this evolving war. Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry wrote, "No system of abolition could have swept away the system more effectively than the advance of our army. Thus, the great question of liberty is working out its own solution." This is before the Emancipation Proclamation. This is before Lincoln's sweeping edicts. The arrival of the army and people voting with their feet are changing the mentality. A soldier who only signed off as ELF from the 2nd Wisconsin wrote, "Hundreds have come into the various camps, some with their trappings and others without them. Women carrying their children, old men and cripples hobbling after the advance column of the Black Army of Fugitives from slavery." Constant Hanks from the 80th New York added, "During one day, some 80 or so of these poor people came into our lines. Women with little children in their arms, everyone barefoot and bareheaded. Some of the women were naked down to the waists. One of them had her back all cut to pieces with the whips for trying to run away once before. She too had a little girl, some 3 or 4 years old. They all looked faint and hungry." And it's vitally, vitally important to understand that this is happening everywhere that the U.S. Army is coming into contact with the institution of slavery. It had already happened at places like Corinth, Mississippi, and in Beaufort, South Carolina, the Virginia Peninsula, and now here in Fredericksburg. The commander of the federal forces here in Fredericksburg, a guy named Irvin McDowell, wrote kind of proudly to Washington, D.C. officials on May 5th, and he forwards a newspaper clipping from Richmond. And the clipping says this, so this is a Confederate news clipping that McDowell advances to Washington. "The protection afforded by the enemy to fugitive slaves is said to be playing havoc with the slave property in the neighborhood of Fredericksburg. Slaves are flocking to the Federal Army by the hundreds. As many as 80 have gone off at one time from the river and by the plantations. It is said there is scarcely a slaveholder in Fredericksburg who has not lost one or more of their slaves." But also the reality is, all of these people who are fleeing to Union lines, the inevitable question becomes, what do we do with them? The Army wasn't prepared for this. The Army wasn't ready for this. And yet, by their very arrival, the people fleeing from slavery are essentially saying, we're here. What do we do now? A railroad official guesstimated that in that summer of 1862, 10,000 people had fled to Union lines. And so it came down to federal officials writing to Washington, D.C. to ask for clarification. What do we do with these people? They're here, whether we want them to be or not. They are here in our lines. Irvin McDowell, he arrives with 30,000 soldiers. 10,000 more people who arrive put emphasis on his supplies, on his rations, on his equipment. They can't all stay here. So what do we do with them? And so that railroad agent who estimated that 10,000 were coming through, that number comes from the fact that they are forwarding them to Washington, almost as if to say, here they come, what are you going to do with them? And so federal policy begins to change. Abraham Lincoln begins to think about this process a little bit differently. And so to talk about the changing, evolving federal policy, as well as the dynamic of the people on the ground as well, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Toy, who will take it from here. Okay?
All right, thanks, Ryan, and I am more than a smidge shorter than Ryan. Hopefully you can all see me. It's a nice small stand. So as Ryan mentioned, in the summer of 1862, Fredericksburg witnessed a mass exodus of enslaved people across the Rappahannock River and into Union lines. Ryan said that one observer calculated that 10,000 enslaved people crossed the river. But this is the summer of 1862, right? The Emancipation Proclamation hasn't been addressed yet. It is not going to be released until January 1st, 1863. And the question we then have to ask ourselves is why? Right? As Ryan mentioned, the U.S. Army, they hadn't invited enslaved people into their lines. They aren't prepared to care for this many refugees, but still enslaved people go. And to answer these questions, we have to shift our perspective away from formal political policy. As Beth mentioned, right, often when you hear us battlefield types talk about wars, we'll tell you about battles and we'll tell you about federal policy. But to understand what's happening here in Fredericksburg, in the summer and the winter of 1862, we have to shift towards conditions on the ground. We have to look at the ways in which people are making policy with their feet. Wars, of course, create chaos and they create instability. The Civil War was no exception, right? That's another thing I think we sometimes forget about the Civil War because it's long been romanticized, right, as a brother's war, as an honorable war. And the reality is that all wars are chaotic, they are all violent, and they all create massive instability. In the case of the Civil War, this chaos and this instability also undermined the violent systems that held the institution of slavery in place, right? It creates space and opportunity for people to negotiate for their freedom and to resist these powerful forces in the United States that had long held people in bondage. And so long before the federal government ever issues the Emancipation Proclamation, long before the federal government officially considers any type of large-scale emancipation, enslaved people recognize that this war has created the opportunity that they had long been hoping for. George Downey, who was an enslaved man who lived here in Fredericksburg, spoke about his loyalty to the Union Army in a report to the Southern Claims Commission after the war was over. And Downey explained that he was always committed to the Union cause because he always believed that the US Army would be successful and, quote, would set my family free, right? So from the beginning of the war, he believed that this army was going to set his family free. A teenage boy on the Virginia Peninsula, you can go to the next slide, Beth. So the Virginia Peninsula, if you don't know, is down in this bottom left corner. Fort Monroe, which we're gonna talk about in a second, is down there. And when the Union Army gets to the peninsula in the summer of 1862, an enslaved boy tells US soldiers, quote, that since the election of Lincoln, Black residents had been holding meetings on the different farms in the neighborhood, at which men would collect together and talk about matters pertaining to the insurrection. So enslaved people, right, are paying attention. They're holding meetings, right? We don't talk about this part of the war. We sort of think about sometimes the Union Army arriving in a place and people just, suddenly having the inspiration to flee, and that's not at all reality. Enslaved people are paying attention from the very moment that politicians in Washington start talking about a war, at the very moment that the Confederacy decides to secede. They're paying attention and they're biding their time and they're calculating, right, when is the best opportunity to strike for freedom. So perhaps most famously, right, as Ryan alluded to, there's an episode at Fort Monroe in May of 1861. Fort Monroe, as I said, is down here on the peninsula. We're up here in Fredericksburg, so not too, I feel like it looks farther away actually on this map than it is in reality, but Fort Monroe is now a national park if you want to go visit. But famously, right, we often hear about the quote-unquote contraband decision that was made by the Union commander Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe. And the way the traditional story goes, right, is that three enslaved men, Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, and James Townsend, who often just show up in the record as three enslaved men, and they're not even named, that they were being forced to labor for the Confederate Army, and they flee to Fort Monroe, and Benjamin Butler accepts them into his lines and writes to Washington and says, what am I gonna do with these people? They're being forced to labor for the Confederate cause, therefore I can consider them quote unquote contraband of war and confiscate them as property in war, right? But the part of the story that we don't often hear about this episode at Fort Monroe is that Mallory, Baker, and Townsend didn't just show up at Fort Monroe one day. In fact, when they get in front of Benjamin Butler, the commander there, they say that if they aren't sent back, those at home, quote, would understand that they were among friends and more would come the next day. So these are not three desperate men taking a shot in the dark, trying to see if this Union Army is really what it's cracked up to be. These are very much an advanced guard of the enslaved community on the Virginia Peninsula, going to find out whether or not the US Army is going to prove to be the allies that they had believed they would be from the outset of the war. Enslaved people, as Brian said, do this all across the wartime South at the very beginning of the war, right? Again, we're talking about 1861. And the experiences that they have differ based on who's in command wherever they go. Not everybody is welcomed. But still they went. And just in their going, they not only deprived the Confederacy of their labor, but they also went to work in direct support of the Union war effort. So those 3 men at Fort Monroe, Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, James Townsend, they immediately go to work as stonemasons for the Union Army. And incidentally, by the way, Frank Baker, by 1865, is well on his way to buying his own house. And the war's not even over yet. So, as Ryan also mentioned, right, as the war progressed, the U.S. Army moved through the slaveholding South, and white soldiers learned more and more, not just about slavery, but also, again, about the contributions that enslaved people were making to the Union war effort. Because they saw the Union Army as a potential liberator, right, they throw their lot in with the Army in very tangible ways. One woman, for example, named Mary, was working at the Gosport Navy Yard where the ironclad ships were being built in the Confederacy, and she actually takes papers with the design of those ships, hides them in her dress, and takes them directly to Washington, D.C., right, making herself a direct agent of the war. Others provide George McClellan with information about the strength of Confederate forces on the Virginia Peninsula during the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. Unfortunately, McClellan doesn't listen to all of their information about the strength of the Confederate Army, right, if you know how the Peninsula Campaign goes. But they're still providing that information, right? And Union soldiers are going to respond to that. They're going to start to see that enslaved people are very much loyal to the Union cause. A confidant of Lincoln's, a man named John W. Forney, takes stock of this situation in 1862, and he writes in the Philadelphia Press, quote, "Let us admit that it is from Black refugees that we received the most accurate information. It was a refugee who gave the first notice of the evacuation of Manassas to General McClellan, and other refugees who brought news of the flight from Yorktown during the Virginia Peninsula Campaign." Similarly, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported around the same time that enslaved people, quote, "profess themselves willing to work, fight, or do anything for us. If we whip out the Southern Army, they will be allowed to work for themselves." And so again, they understand, and the white Northern public begins to understand over the course of 1862, that in many ways, the most loyal people in the South are the Black residents of the South, enslaved and free. And with each opportunity that the enslaved and Black people in the South take to participate in the war effort, they're going to help change the tide of the war. They're going to, in particular, help influence Northern opinion towards a more emancipationist policy in 1862. In the summer of 1862, a soldier from the 80th New York actually wrote about how his experiences with enslaved people were forcing him to consider questions that he may not have been prepared to ask in 1861 when the war broke out. He wrote, quote, "One finds the question rising involuntarily. Is the Black man a man? Warmed with the same sun, hurt with the same weapons, having the same feelings, affections, aspirations that the white man has. Why then should he be a slave to his fellow man?" The soldier continued, "Your correspondent, in common with many others in the regiment and surrounding ones, has secured the services of a man on Friday, who was a coachman and a man of all work, to a prominent secessionist farmer down the Rappahannock. I find him to be a capital help, skilled and prepared to render almost any service required. I shall have no compunctions whatever in using his services of the contraband, in promoting the," and he puts contraband in quote, by the way, because he realizes the irony of that term, right? He's being forced to confront the irony of that term. He says, "I shall have no compunctions whatever in using the services of the contraband in promoting the interest of the Union cause, by promoting the present of one of its humblest supporters, and of giving him besides such aid and comfort in the matter of reaching the freedom that he craves." Okay, so the soldier is realizing from his experiences with these refugees who are coming not only into Union lines, but who are voluntarily laboring for the Union Army at this point, that he has to ask himself, right? Why then should he be a slave to his fellow man? And he also recognizes and is publishing this, right, in a newspaper, that these are some of, he says, the most humble supporters of the Union cause. Some parts up here, sorry about that. So again, reports like these will help in the summer and the fall of 1862 helped the loyal white American public recognize the value and the ingenuity of enslaved people's efforts. And it's necessary, right, to change public opinion, because we know that Washington can't just make a decision and hope that the rest of the public will go along with it. The war is not the most popular thing. You know, we sometimes think about the war as being this sort of straightforward effort, and that's simply not the case, right? Abraham Lincoln is constantly balancing the politics of the situation. Are people going to continue to support this war? And how will the decisions I make impact the ways in which people are or are not willing to support this war? But because white soldiers and the white public are seeing the ways in which enslaved people are participating in the war and are being forced to ask the question of why should a man be a slave to his fellow man, right? They're going to start to, it's going to generate that change that Lincoln needs to support more expansive emancipationist policies. So in the summer of 1862, Lincoln is going to pass what's called the Second Confiscation Act. It precedes the Emancipation Proclamation. And what the Second Confiscation Act does is it allows the U.S. Army to formally emancipate enslaved people who run into Union lines, enslaved people deserted by their enslavers who flee their homes with the advance of the U.S. Army, and enslaved people in places occupied by the U.S. Army. It's a much more expansive act, as the name implies, right? It's the second, meaning there was a first. The first only applied to men who had been forced to labor for the Confederate cause, right? The Second Confiscation Act widely expands the terms of the first. And the Second Confiscation Act, what we also often forget, is this act coming in the summer of 1862 calls for Lincoln to issue a proclamation that will apply to the people who aren't included in this act, right? The people who aren't included in this act are people who are still in places that are still in rebellion against the federal government. Those are the people that the Emancipation Proclamation is going to include. So as a consequence of all of these factors, right, as Ryan mentioned, by the time the U.S. Army arrived in the summer of 1862, Matthew Bernard will flee from slavery and join he's not becoming a soldier at this point, but he's going to go and work for the Iron Brigade. And he will actually return to Fredericksburg with the Iron Brigade during the Battle of Fredericksburg. And incidentally, the Iron Brigade will be positioned right on the Mansfield plantation. So Matthew is going to have what I'm sure was a remarkable experience of actually, one, returning to the place where he had been enslaved, but his freedom is protected by the U.S. Army, and he will witness the U.S. Army arrest his enslaver, Arthur Bernard, during the Battle of Fredericksburg. Another man, Andrew Weaver, who had been enslaved by J. Horace Lacey, the owner of Chatham Manor, which is part of our park, and Elwood Manor, which is also part of our park. Andrew Weaver will return with the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. And another man, George H. Washington, enslaved in Spotsylvania County, will be with the 8th Connecticut Infantry during the Battle of Fredericksburg. And again, all of these people, they haven't had the opportunity yet to enlist as soldiers, but they are still voluntarily providing their service to the U.S. Army, usually receiving pay for that work. During the Battle of Fredericksburg, Black residents also continued their direct support of the U.S. war effort by providing intelligence just like they had on the Virginia Peninsula during the Peninsula Campaign. James Hardy, one of Burnside's staff officers, actually notes this in his correspondence. He writes, quote, "Just learned that a free Black person reports the enemy in position on the hills with abattis in their front, ravines intervening, impractical for troops." Right, and we only get these glimpses, right, of enslaved people's contribution because we're so dependent on the written record to, be able to testify to these accounts. But we know that thousands of refugees are with the U.S. Army at this point, and so for every account that we have written down, every person whose name we know, there are scores more whose names we don't and whose service we just don't necessarily have recorded in the written record, or we haven't found yet, which Molly's going to talk to us more about. Remembering to complicate that understanding too, thank goodness. But of course, right, we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that wartime freedom, like everything else in war, was complex. It was difficult, it was often dangerous. As Ryan mentioned, the U.S. Army is not prepared, neither army is prepared to fight a war of the scale that it has reached by 1862. And the US Army is not prepared to care for tens of thousands of refugees who have come into their lines. And so when refugees go into Union lines at this point in the war, they are confronted with really inhospitable and terrible conditions. Poor sanitation, not great food supplies, sometimes violence from the hands of soldiers who are supposed to be their protectors. And those who had fled in the summer of 1862, right, across the Rappahannock into what became Stafford County, when the US Army left the area, right, they wouldn't have been safe anymore. And so they likely ended up in places like Washington, D.C. This happens, again, all across the wartime South. Fredericksburg changes hands quite a few times, so we don't have a stable refugee community. But all across the South, right, if the US Army decides it's going to give up a fort, that means that the refugee community that took shape right outside of that fort is now at risk. And so freedom could be lost far more quickly than it could be gained during the war. Charles Sproul, who was a man enslaved by J. Horace Lacey, again, the owner of Chatham and Elwood, he actually went south to Fort Monroe. And when he got to Fort Monroe, he would have encountered what amounted to nothing less than a humanitarian crisis, right? If you saw in the picture, Fort Monroe is a fort on the coast. It is on a peninsula, right, as the Virginia Peninsula implies. It is surrounded by salt water. There's no source for fresh water. Was never built to support a population the size of which took shape during the Civil War. And again, the US Army was just unprepared to care for the needs of all of these people. And the fact that they still went, right, despite these conditions, tells us how resilient of freedom seekers they were. They carved out opportunity in an increasingly devastating war. We know of people like Charles Sproul, for example, because he eventually enlisted in the US Army, and he's buried in our National Cemetery at Fredericksburg. And we have pieces of his story. We know of Matthew Bernard because a soldier in the Iron Brigade wrote about him. He didn't survive the war, and so we only know about him because he made such an impact, and his story made such an impact on the soldiers he was with that they wrote it down. But the thousands of people who made this bold choice, of those thousands, we know very, very few names. But we recently learned a few new names, and so I am very excited to pass the mic over to my colleague, Maddie, to introduce you to that story.
Good evening. My name is Maddie Hollis. I have the immense privilege to introduce our next speaker, Molly Lucas Green. When the planning for our Fredericksburg 160th began months ago, I was originally not even scheduled to do this program when we kind of divided up who was going to do what, but then something really special happened. Back in September, late September, I was working at the Fredericksburg battlefield in the visitor center. And Molly and her husband, Keith, came into the visitor center and began asking questions about historic sites in Culpeper. So we talked for a bit, we shared stories, shared information, and Molly was kind enough to tell me her family story in immense detail. And I knew immediately that it was a story with immense value that needed to be shared and given an audience to hear about. So we're both in the right place at the right time that day. So it is interactions like this that make our work as public historians worthwhile, and it's definitely something that I'm going to remember further along in my career. So a little bit about Molly. She lives in Jonesboro, Georgia, but she spends most of her time on the road working as an educator and a business owner. She has a long list of accolades that I can go into, including a master's in social foundations of education from GSU. So from conversations that we have had since September, I can tell that Molly really puts importance in the power behind visiting a historic place in person, especially a historic place where your family descends from. And so in 2020, Molly founded her own company, Infinite Inquiry, the first company of its kind to put a classroom on wheels. She takes her students all over the country in what she refers to as expeditionary teaching, which is really cool. In the same way that her ancestors changed the lives of their descendants to come by moving, by migrating. Two things that Molly really wanted me to stress in terms of what is most important to her is migration as well as education. The work of the National Park Service is also central to the curriculum that she has developed for her students, and she shared with me that her students are proud owners of National Park Service passport books. Ever since our initial meeting, Molly has served as a wealth of information. She has generously shared her family's research with us, and currently, as Becca was discussing, we don't know much about some of the people who were enslaved in this area at the time of the Civil War. So the addition of her family's story has proved to already be a major contribution to our understanding of what enslaved people experienced as the U.S. Army moved through Virginia in 1862. And it also highlights the nuances of all of these experiences. Not every enslaved person who ran to Union lines had the same story, had the same outcome, and that's an important thing to consider as well. My coworker, Becca Toy, had the wonderful idea to invite Molly here during this celebration to share her family story with you. So the information that you will hear from Molly is a testament to the importance of collecting new stories and also creating a welcoming environment, something that Civil War parks have struggled with and not done historically. So in terms of the information that Molly is going to share with you, much of what we can learn about enslaved people in the past is found through both information passed down between generations and also documentation that can be used to support these stories. So some of those things, especially for refugees during the Civil War, include Army records, diaries and letters, as Becca discussed, pension records, and census records after 1865. Prior to 1865, the identities of enslaved people were not typically recorded on legal documents. Enslaved people were also barred from legally marrying, voting, learning to read and write, but as you will hear in a bit, some enslaved people did become literate on their own, and of course they married, but those marriages were not respected by the court system. So on census records, enslaved people were typically tallied and their ages and genders recorded for the purpose of attaching monetary value to them, and their names were left out. Molly shared with me that through genealogy sites that she has explored, like Ancestry, the trail of information for her family does not extend beyond her two descendants, which she's going to talk about tonight. Conversely, my family has always lived in Virginia, and unfortunately, my family enslaved people in Virginia. And I have the luxury of going back through Ancestry, tracking my family members all the way back to the 1600s in Virginia, but I do not know any of the names of people who my family enslaved. So definitely, important to pass on these stories for that reason. In many instances, historians have failed to show equal attention to the stories of enslaved people and have even expressed doubt regarding their validity. Without the hard work of Molly's family over many decades, digging, looking through records, finding what information they could, the story that Molly has for you would not be able to be shared tonight. So the staff here at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania Military Park would like to thank dearly Molly and her family for coming all of this way to speak to you tonight. So it is my honor to introduce to you Molly Lucas Green.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I must say, though, that I took a bit of a detour. I know that, you want all of these minutes to be spent on the battlefield and, all the details of the war, but I'm a woman and a creative person, and, I gotta get a little artsy-fartsy with you for a second, okay? So forgive me for that, but it's the language I speak is the arts, okay? I'm also a little strange. I promise I have 10 toes, but I don't wear shoes. People laugh at me, but it's all about the road. I'm a runner. I'm a cross-country avid runner, and I do most of that running barefoot, just because I like to be close to nature and the Lord. But it's something about that that makes me feel a little bit more in tune with the place that I live, the planet itself. But I found this quote by Bell Hooks, which I think encompasses the entire Lucas journey, which was salvation's not so much in someone's church or, in someone's big house. It's in getting on the road and boogieing on down. It doesn't have to be yellow either. I'm just gonna go. Every morning I want to see it when the sun comes up. So there's something about traveling that liberates me. And from what I've discovered over the years of reading through my ancestors' documentation, they love to travel too. And so I'll begin. It's organized in an artistic and an educational or expeditionary way, because that's who I am. And I kind of created that because I just couldn't jive going and working in the public school system in the traditional format with my personality, especially since my time there at K through 12 was a misery. And I'll admit to it being a misery, not because I hated learning, but because I hated the idea that there was only one story I was told. And it did not include me. I had no stake in that story, and I didn't find value in being in a classroom. So when I left, and I left often, sometimes with permission and sometimes without, you'll see as I go through the presentation that, I did my own thing. And my mom still loves me, but I tell you what, she's got some grays over there because of me. She's back there in the back. So my mother's not the Lucas, of course. So we'll talk about her briefly, and she'll help us out a little bit in the presentation. I say us like I'm really gonna have two of us working, but she will contribute in just a little way. So you can go forward for me. Featured here are my revolutionary parents, who were both new members of the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in 1976. There is Sister Akila, Brother Omar, and little brother Sultan. Now, little brother Sultan is the stepson to Brother Omar, and it's this mixed family, but I'm told this is the day that I was brought into the world. Maybe not into the world, but definitely into the possibility of living. This day, this very day. Go ahead.
Evanston sits just north of Chicago. Racial redlining was imposed upon my small township just as much as our urban giant to the south. My father was sent to Evanston to study at Northwestern University. Instead, he was attracted to the large presence of Muslim brothers, always so fresh and so clean. They shared a corner with Hecky's pork ribs, selling bean pies, fresh fish, H&G.
All right, one more. And this is the birth announcement that brought my father back to his family after almost 4 years of complete silence. My maternal grandmother, my father's mother, was actually investing in a private investigator to find my father at this time. Essentially what he had done is decided that he didn't like any of their history, he didn't want to be part of that, and found a woman that agreed with him. She's back there. Revolutionaries, both of them. My birth announcement was the first communication with his family after he was sent to Northwestern University in Illinois as a Catholic out of high school, and he comes back as a Muslim with a baby and a ready-made family. So things were a little hectic. And it was my birth announcement, of course, so I'm kind of in the middle of this thing. I promise I'll get to the Civil War, just hold tight with me. All right, go ahead.
I was not surprised to have a girl. We had always referred to the baby as she. When I first saw her after delivery, her eyes were wide open and bright. Her arms and legs were in full motion. She was beautiful. Whenever I visited the nursery, she was asleep. When they brought her to me, most times she was awake, but would soon be asleep throughout the feeding. I thank Allah for allowing us to raise this child.
At a time when road travel was risky business for people of color, Gramps was the original gangster. It was America's bicentennial, and Gramps mistakenly thought that he was dying from complications to diabetes. And with his brand new splurge of a purchase in this big RV in 1976, one of his first trips was coming to see his brand new granddaughter. And there I am, hanging out with my favorite guy in the world. Growing up in that RV during the summers with Gramps and the family on those long trips, I learned an appreciation for expedition and also for the Dwight Eisenhower interstate system, which connected all parts of the continental United States for the average American.
So at about 10 years old, my mother, always down for adventure herself, just decided she was done with Evanston. It was expensive. She wanted to find some support. She went down to join my paternal side of the family. There weren't many of them there at the time, but that was the intention. We're gonna have a recitation.
She's a bit of a tomboy and into all sports. Now that she's 10 years old. She's classy. She's sassy. And sometimes a grouch. Now that she's 10 years old. Mom says she's picky with her head in the clouds, but can rule both brothers and stand out in a crowd. She's a self-starter, well-traveled, ambitious, and cute. With money signs for eyeballs, she's counting her loot. She's too grown to be young, loves to read Stephen King now that she's 10 years old. One day she could be court judge supreme. But ever since birth, she's been a queen. But right now, she's just 10 years old.
Sure is that.
Now 69% black, the urban center promotes its history of opportunity and racial harmony. Civic pride, in fact, has acquired an almost religious quality, as if on the seventh day God hadn't rested after all, but decided to make Atlanta instead, and saw that it was surprisingly good.
Hey, Tom. So anyway, yes, we love our city there. I will say that I was new to the idea of having a majority black population coming from Evanston. And in Atlanta, I had some expectations of joining my people. And that expectation did not get met in the way that I thought it would. I was there from about 10 until now. And my first real exposure to Georgia history was in a Georgia history class in the 8th grade. And in that class, my nice teacher was wearing her pink and green black Greek shirt or sweater, and she showed us Gone with the Wind, and there was no critical talk about it afterwards. And all I knew is I wanted to be in the role that Scarlett had. Go ahead.
Late spring of 1990, my 8th grade Georgia history classmates and I were perched in front of David O. Selznick's 50th anniversary production of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. The romance, set in antebellum Georgia, had been a gift bestowed, an opportunity to nap when the lights went out, or conversely, a chance to fully immerse ourselves in the drama that Scarlett created all over the Piedmont region. In the span of those few remaining days before our transition to high school, infatuated I became under the oppressive myth called Magnolia.
Pause here for a second. So from this, I want to share that this was my understanding of Georgia history. Outside of that, the war was about states' rights. I was taken to every monument that was supported in this film and others, but nowhere in that was there a critical discussion about what we were witnessing. And as I look back and reflect, of course, with 2020 vision, I interpret it as a form of abuse, child abuse. It took me in a direction because all the while, Gone with the Wind is my favorite movie and I'm telling the world at 10, 11, 12, probably until I figured out it shouldn't be my favorite movie. But it was a great love story, but there was something about the historical piece that I really wanted to identify with but didn't understand. Note at this point, I've been raised in Evanston with my mother, not exposed to Lucases at all, except for our RV trips during the summer. So I get 2 or 3 weeks where I get to go see a grandparent, but there's no real talk about where we come from, why our last name is Lucas, what that means, nothing, you know. And of course, no one really wants to talk about painful things anyway, so I'm gonna give them a pass and say, well, maybe, you know, it was just a painful thing to talk about. Our country hadn't moved along far enough for them to feel comfortable talking about it in a critical way with me. Maybe that's what it was. Go ahead. So my favorite guy watched me grow up and was really my father figure. He and I are here together on the day I graduated from high school. This is the day I also became a teen parent. It was a transition. Essentially, I felt like there was nowhere for me to call my roots. I was grabbing hold. Let's think about it in terms of hydroponic gardening and planting in soil, right? You can pick that hydroponic plant up and take it wherever you want it. You've got to force feed it nutrients though, or it's gonna die, right? So I'm sitting in my classroom getting fed nutrients. It's not the nutrients that I need, I'm growing, but you know, how am I growing? You know, how am I developing? So it's the soil that organically feeds itself. And that's what I was probably looking for without that vocabulary, but I was a lost child. And so the words that follow are my grandfather's concerns about me and his private journal that he wrote in 1993, which I did not get access to until 2016, well after his death. I used it as part of this presentation because I thought it would bring the story to completeness. So I'm going to share a very personal part of this story as a part to segue into the great part about Moses and Mildred during 1862 of August, right around the same week, same year, same with geographical distance as Timothy O'Sullivan's photo in 1862 of August with the fugitive Negroes fording the Rappahannock River. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it because I've heard you all pronounce Rappahannock a whole lot of different ways, but I'll get to it. Go for it.
A journal entry of Roy Allen Lucas, Sr. Day after Thanksgiving, 1993. What I found out last night. I want to help Malika, but I have no idea how to get next to her or inside of her very defensive mind. On Thanksgiving, Malika and Skippy had a giant blow-up. It was just a question of time before the Third World War began. Not trying to beat up on Skippy, but he was not going to step in after many years had passed and correct Malika. We still do not know the underlying cause of Malika's problem. Skippy does not have the knowledge to deal with the teenage girl who has a lot of problems. Love is not going to solve the problems that have taken many years to grow and fester. She is going to have to recognize that she has a problem and then be willing to accept help from someone outside of herself. It is my opinion that she is not there now. I have some bad thoughts that Malika will never, ever reach the point where she admits that she's going down the wrong road to live a productive life. After a brief try, Skippy has given up. Connie and Kim seem to have put it down as a wasted cause.
So you might have noticed that I did not use my last name during my teenage years. I was Malika Ayin, and I would almost call myself Malika Ayin X, because I just didn't want to be associated with a family that had caused me so much pain. And as we move forward, go ahead, go to the next one. I ended up at Tri-Cities High School, which is a visual and performing arts high school in Atlanta. It's the place where, you know, Outkast, if you're into hip hop, graduated. I listened to them rap in the hallways, just freestyling and just killing it. But everybody there was wild. We were all artists, you know. It was also a Title I school, so we weren't just creative, but we were kind of poor too. And it just kind of resulted in what hip hop is, which is a certain group of people who are expressing themselves. And a lot of these topics came up, especially in reference to the Civil War and other critical things that we had essentially been sold some Kool-Aid that we probably shouldn't have had. You know, like we were drinking the wrong Kool-Aid. And so I'm going to move forward so I can make sure I don't lose my focus.
A correspondence from John Lewis, 5th District, Georgia, House of Representatives, Washington District of Columbia. To Miss Malika Ayin Lucas, 27 May, 1994. Dear Malika, congratulations on placing second in the 1994 5th Congressional District High School Arts Competition. Your artwork entitled From One Generation to Another was most impressive. I wish you much success in all your future endeavors. If I can assist you in any way, please call on me. With all good wishes, sincerely, John Lewis, Member of Congress.
I'm sure that John Lewis wrote 100 of these letters to 100 little teenagers, right? But this was special to me. It kind of made me say, John Lewis, okay, maybe I need to pay more attention to of the lifestyle that he lived. And I just kind of started to question things a little bit, but it was that validation in that typical letter that politicians write that made me feel special at 17 years old. And so because of that letter, I started to think a little differently. But it wasn't just the difference in thinking, it was the welcoming of Oscar Allen Lucas to Atlanta. Oscar Allen Lucas was my great-grandfather. He was the father to my favorite guy, Roy Allen Lucas Sr. He was essentially a hermit and a recluse. He did not communicate very well with his family. He was very much a feminist, it seems. He was born on Valentine's Day. He adored his mother. He adored the entire maternal line. He was mad that his last name wasn't his mama's last name instead of his daddy's last name. It started to show me that he had a little animosity about being a Lucas himself. But in that process, Oscar came to live with us, and he was in his late 80s at that time. His time in Atlanta was nurtured by my mother, who just liked old guys, and Oscar was just this beautiful man. We would take him fresh groceries, and in that time, we would get a chance to learn a little bit about him. He would show us pictures. He kept these same pictures that you're going to see in a moment on the wall, and he would talk about their names, but I really didn't get the stories. And so I'll go to the next slide and let Oscar tell a little bit of his story. It will be read by me, but they are excerpts from him. This is his driver's license, the last driver's license that he owned. His mind was sharp until he died at 90 years old. He was born in 1906 on Valentine's Day to a beautiful woman, but you have to think about the other side because we're talking about the paternal side of his family. I want to bring your attention to his height, because he was 1 inch taller than Moses, who was the freeman who freed himself. He was also a very small man at about 150 pounds, 160 pounds. We can go to the next one, please. So here you all have several pictures of Oscar throughout his life. He made a point to share the image you see where he is the great-grandson sitting on his Scottish great-grandmother's lap, with his mother standing in the rear and his grandmother seated to the other side. Through Ancestry.com, I've been able to meet descendants of that family. I've been able to meet descendants of the Lucas family, and I'll share with you how I started to change my mind about being a Lucas. So I'm going to read a short excerpt from Oscar's letter. He talks about 3 things that I found to be very interesting, because at this time I was a freshman in undergraduate school sitting in a social foundations of education classroom, deciding if I wanted to be a teacher. I had decided for sure I did not want to be a teacher, even though that's what I do. I had decided then that I didn't want to be because it just seemed like so much trouble for so little pay. But Oscar's letter is what I inherited in 1996 when he passed. He says, "Greetings on my 85th birthday. Despite the pervasiveness of wealth and power, or the absence of them in human relations, my cerebrations have peaked after more than 8 decades speculating at the following. 1, chromosomes and genes, genetics and genealogy. 2, the African diaspora, which first developed thousands of years ago, yet much of our nation continues to be entertained with the fantasy that Africans first dispersed worldwide less than 500 years ago, after the rape of the Caribbean islands by Christopher Columbus. And 3, racism, as threaded through the conception, birth, and life of the Constitution of the United States of America." Now, this was his opinion before Barack Obama. This was his opinion before his great-granddaughter saved herself. He was an angry man who was estranged from his own children and his own grandchildren. The only interaction he had with Lucas was my brother and I, thanks to my mother, who was a Mitchell, not a Lucas by nature. Of course, she's a Lucas, she married my husband, my father. But he was alone all the time, and he was writing these letters over and over again, sometimes duplicate copies of things. He was attempting to write a book. He was very interested in cousins, but not so interested in sons and daughters and grandchildren. It was interesting because I think that had something to do with them not knowing who he had been and a chance to start anew. So he traveled all over the country and eventually even to Scotland to research his ancestors. All right, so as we moved from Oscar had relocated to Atlanta to be there with his wife, who was suffering from dementia, and she was going to be closer to her family there. His time, though, was essentially far away from all of his relatives, not that he was close to them anyway. Can we get one more thing? This is the famous photo that Maddie, my little angel, introduced me to on the 30th of September. She didn't say that the 30th of September was my husband's birthday and my granddaughter's birthday. And I had him trekking to this park because the birthday party didn't start till 6. So I was like, oh, let's go down to the Civil War battlefield, because, you know, I do this. I've been doing it for 20 years, going to plantations and battlefields throughout the Deep South. I was looking for clues. I wanted to know what the lives of slaves were like. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to trek the trek that they trekked. I want to trek Culpeper. I want to travel the road. You know, it's something about the expedition. Again, I say this, right? Go ahead and give me one more clip, please, Beth.
Biographical data. Ancestors. Moses Lucas, Mildred Jane Willett, as recorded by Oscar Allen Lucas, July 1974. If the record can be trusted, Mildred Jane Willett was married to Moses on the 15th of September, 1848, when she was about 13 years old. Moses, who we now know as Moses Lucas, was 10 years her senior. As slaves, they were married by Benjamin Withers, presumably on the plantation of Jane's owner, Pickett Withers. An 1898 statement dictated by Moses a few months before his death claims that this 1848 marriage was recorded in the Old Family Bible. He likely was referencing the Withers Family Bible, as he and Jane were both illiterate. The plantation rolled for hundreds of hilly acres west of the Rappahannock. On the road between Jeffersonton and Brandy spread the wooded hills of Liberty Hall near the northern tip of Culpeper County, Virginia. Young adventurer Robert Greene settled there in the early 1700s. 3 generations had managed the lands by the death of Moses Greene in 1859. Moses, the enslaved, was 29 years old. In August of 1862, along a 10-mile stretch of the river, from White Sulphur Springs near Jeffersonton at the north to the railroad crossing east of Brandy Station, the Greene and Withers plantations lay. Jane and Moses, with several of their children, lived and slaved. As the Confederate Army milled around and over his owner's plantation, Moses was impressed into Confederate service as a mule skinner, but not for long. While August thunderstorms for 2 days swelled the Rappahannock, drenched the armies, frustrated the generals, and reshaped their tactics, Moses, while hunting for his lost mule, crossed an unguarded bridge over the river and made his way to the Union lines. A few days later, and several miles northward, the Second Battle of Bull Run was joined and fought to the shame of Union armies. But within those few days, somehow or another, Moses went back by stealth through Confederate lines. He gathered his wife and 4 of their children, and under cover of woods, weeds, night, and more thunderstorms, slipped back across the Rappahannock. and with his wife and 2 of their children rejoined the Union soldiers. His other 2 children were lost in the attempt to recross the raging Rappahannock. The family cooked, washed, and labored with the Union Army for a while, but soon wound up in the District of Columbia, where it spent the next 36 years until the deaths of Jane and Moses in 1898. They had 7 more children, the last 4 of which were boys. Of 16 reported pregnancies by Jane, 4 remain completely unknown. There were the 2 lost crossing the Rappahannock. The names of surviving children which have come down to us are John W. Lucas, apparently a farmer and preacher and teacher who went on to Texas, Lucy Jane and Mary V., both born in slavery in Culpeper County, Virginia. Born in the District of Columbia after the war were Nancy, Celia, Lizzie, and 4 boys, Moses Grant, George, Joseph Henry, and James Oscar.
Now, James Oscar is the author of the next note that I will share with you some details about Moses and Mildred Jane. This will be pretty much the end of what I'm going to share today. But as I'm going through this list, I'd like for us to leave it on James Oscar. He describes his mother and father, Moses and Mildred, which we only have the one photo that you all saw already. I found this letter intriguing. First of all, Oscar was still estranged from his father, James Oscar. So let me go down the list one more time. There was Mildred and Moses. There was James Oscar, the last of 16 births. From James Oscar, there was Oscar Allen. Oscar Allen being my great-grandfather who lived in Atlanta with me at the end of his life. And from there's Roy Allen Lucas Sr. We don't talk about the living people, so we'll stop at Roy Allen Lucas Sr. He's also just, I gotta love this guy who's so safe, just a beautiful soul, Roy. But we're gonna go back to James Oscar. The young man you see here, he's about 20 years old at this time. It seems that the entire family took photos on this day because the ages look about appropriate for the same day as you're looking at the gray hair on some of them and the youth on some of the other ones. But in 1942, on December 2nd, James Oscar writes a note to his son, Oscar Allen. He complains about him not calling and not visiting. And Oscar at the end says, I was trying to avoid y'all, so, just answer my questions kind of thing. So James Oscar goes into this short biography about his parents. And I thought it was important to share with you all because this is the human part that we don't often hear or learn about in any way. Father, Moses Lucas, born about 1825 in Virginia near Culpeper, a slave in the Green family, illiterate, of the highest poetic and moral ideals. That caught me, that part, because the Gone with the Wind and the history classes that taught me it was about states' rights didn't express any of the humanity of these people, So you're sitting in the class and you're assuming all these slaves are happy because that was the lost cause ideology, and the second tenet of the lost cause being the Magnolia Myth, be it that slavery civilized us savages. Savages are highly poetic and moral, these are things that shook me. And in 1996, it brought me out of a place of essentially lost on an island somewhere, floating around with my roots getting fed all these weird nutrients, when really I just needed some roots where we actually come from. What did they do? What kind of people were they? Should I have shame about behaving like the savage I'm being called? Or, if I don't know that my people had high poetic and moral ideals, then what's the shame in me doing whatever the hell I want to do? And that's kind of how I wanted the story to follow my chronology, because I think the loss of this history is losing a whole generation and culture of people because they can't hold on to anything. They can't find their stake in this American dream. And I don't know anything more American than the journey that these people took. And so, when I got married, you're not making me drop my last name, honey. I am keeping that Lucas. I was like, go Lucas team. So I got married and I made it a point to be political about my last name because I knew Lucas meant something. And yeah, for a long time I didn't like those people, and even most of the time while they were alive, they were just mean and I didn't want to be bothered. So as they got older, they got nicer, and when they were dead, they were even nicer. So I got a chance to really learn about them without talking to them. It's kind of like being that photographer that gets to just take pictures and you're like, don't talk to me, I'm busy. So Oscar, his description of Moses as highest poetic, moral, and poetic ideals, and to say that essentially for his mother, and this is what I found the most intriguing. Mother, Jane, 10 years his junior, also from the vicinity of Culpeper in the Withers family, illiterate but highly cultured and refined and ambitious. My mama said I was ambitious. These are my roots, and I didn't know that I was supposed to be ambitious. I said, well, if I'm wasting time in school, let me find something else to do. And of course, Tangeray was my friend in high school. You saw the pictures there. It was a loss, and I'm not blaming alcoholism, teenage alcoholism, and all of my misbehavior on not knowing this history, but it certainly played a huge part. And my hatred for school was what let me say, let me leave this building and go find something else to do that's more valuable to me at the time. Had I known that my people were highly cultured and refined and, of the highest poetic ideals, I might have had a different attitude. I might have looked at that history a little differently. I can't say for sure, but I believe that the loss of that was detrimental to my development. And I think it's detrimental to all children's development not to be represented in their culture in the classroom. And so I take this lens and bring it to you because education is our largest social organ. We share all of our values through the educational system. And to deny people parts of their history that is also part of the American history just breaks my heart. And that is why I am drawn to education. I will never leave the field. Yay, I'm on team teacher too. So the last thing I'll say about this letter from James Oscar to Oscar Allen is that Moses was old to be running away and swimming through rivers and stuff. He was 37. He had already labored for almost 4 decades. And for a slave, that was a very old age to be doing that type of journey. And I'm sure there were others like it. But to go once and then come back to get his wife and the children was a lot. And I just am trying to perceive the condition of his body, for example. He's a little guy. And so I'm thinking about how much could he carry, how much could he hold, and was Mildred Jane much bigger? I doubt it. So James Oscar talks a lot about the details of them, but in terms of both of them, he says, both loved and highly respected in their communities until their deaths in about 1898. I just find that he speaks with adoration and respect for his parents, which helped me understand there was no shame carried from slavery, that they were once enslaved people, that I don't believe that James Oscar had any shame. I do think that Oscar Allen had a little bit of self-hate because as he talked about his 3 issues with America and racism and so on, he also goes on to say how he hates being associated with being African because he's not just Black, he's all these other things, and he's being forced to identify as one just because his skin is dark, but he's got all these other Anglo features. It takes us places that I think we need to go and talk about in order to grow and heal. Can we go one more? Oh, another one. Oh, I think we went backwards. To the expeditionary. Go. No, you can push it forward again. There we go. So I make my point to make those babies move every day. I mean, they get all their steps every day. We take trips to Monticello. We take trips all over the country. We go across the seas. But the most important thing that I think all of this has brought about for me is, our trip to Charlottesville, Virginia, I learned that one of the oldest and most continuous garden notations of Thomas Jefferson was his cultivation of the magnolia. And that tree being so beautiful and everywhere throughout the South, being an iconic American tree. I know you would argue it's apple or something, the cherry maybe, but the magnolia is the deep South American tree. Almost everyone can identify this tree all throughout the South. the Magnolia myth, which James Lowen talks about in his book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and what your American history textbook have gotten wrong. His book went as a New York bestseller every time it was republished. It was huge in education, but it was also huge in history, and it was really the groundwork for some of the CRT discussions today. I encourage those of you who are here in the audience to consider what it does to an American, any color, to think that there was one story about the Civil War. And just think about that. And then think about what I've shared with you. How many more stories are in America waiting to be told about people who've stolen their own freedom and that of their children? And it's that idea that I go into the classroom with, and this is why parents are trusting me to teach their children, and primarily children of color, that the history, the faucet is all the way on. Not that I'm telling some truth that is not a truth, or not that I'm not sharing all of the alternative histories and her stories. It's important for me to share with you all that the multiple stories is what makes the entire fabric complete. And the one story we've been told is ragged and falling apart. And I just believe that if we don't start to process this as Congress has brought more value to these national parks, and including the enlargement of their scope to include stories like this as of recent, is a step in the right direction. And people like Maddie and these young rangers who really kind of just changed everything for me, because as I've said, I traveled throughout the South to national parks and state parks and plantations, private and public, looking for things that would help me understand the history, and not feeling welcome until September 30th, 2022. I've been in places where I've been interrogated as if I was a rabble-rouser or a member of the press, and I'm coming into the Confederate Civil War Museum in New Orleans being harassed after I paid $30 to get in there. And watching other people pay $30 and walk right in and have a great time. The screen was my blackness, and it just seemed so unfair. And so I just wanted to make sure that as I conclude, that the multiple stories have got to be integrated into everything that we're doing with these young people, because we're losing children, not because we're telling them lies, but because we're not telling them everything, as much as we know. The national parks have already taken the step. The classroom is still in the industrial age. And so for me, it's about walking your behind out of the classroom and doing things outside at the parks, because this is where things are evolving much faster. If we're still stuck in the industrial complex, then for me, we need to leave. It's time to migrate. It's time to be emancipated with our feet. And so that's what I do. And I just wanted to thank you all for the time. I hope I haven't been too artsy-fartsy for you, and I hope I talked enough about the Civil War.
I gotta tell you, I've been dreading this part of our program, because ever since Maddie introduced us to Molly, I knew that she was going to tell a way better story than we could. And it's like, I'm in charge of wrapping this thing up, and that's a tough act to follow. I personally love the artsy-fartsy bits, and I was taking mental notes of like, hey, we should do this. So thank you, Molly. Of course, we are here to commemorate the Battle of Fredericksburg, and so I want to help kind of pull our story into that particular pivotal moment. The Battle of Fredericksburg, occurred at this really important time during the war, and the Battle of Antietam, of course, had occurred a few months prior, and Abraham Lincoln had issued what we know as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. But going into the campaign here at Fredericksburg, a lot of people worried whether or not Lincoln would kind of stick to his guns when it came to this emancipation policy. How would the outcome of whatever battle might happen here in the East potentially impact the future of this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? For those who might not be familiar with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it was essentially a warning. Abraham Lincoln let the Confederacy know that he was going to release his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, if they did not return to the United States. So he has, kind of forewarned that this larger emancipation policy is coming. And again, people are worried whether or not Lincoln will hold to this path. And in November of 1862, just prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg, Lincoln responds to some of these questions, and he writes, quote, that he should abate no jot of his emancipation policy. But he doesn't stop there when he makes that statement. He went on to explain, quote, the foundations of slavery have been cracked by the war, acknowledging that the institution of slavery was already in the process of crumbling. And that process of crumbling, that process of cracking the foundation of slavery so that it could not survive this war, was begun in no small part by the thousands of refugees like Moses and Mildred who had already claimed freedom for themselves. Following the devastating defeat here at Fredericksburg, people wondered again whether or not Lincoln would back off of this emancipation policy. They wondered, would he carry it out when the Union war effort here in the East was going so poorly? And on Christmas Eve of 1862, Lincoln wrote, quote, he would not if he could, and he could not if he would, withhold his decree of emancipation. He could not if he would, right? Lincoln is committed to emancipation, but he also recognized that he almost doesn't have a choice at this point, right? Lincoln will also write about how he doesn't claim to control events, but rather to be controlled by events. The voting that refugees from slavery did with their feet, of forcing the federal government to respond to their presence, of forcing the Union war effort to encompass the goal of ending the institution of slavery, forced Lincoln's hand, right? And he acknowledges this. Following the battle, enslaved people also don't lose faith in the Union war effort. There's an enslaved woman named Fanny who remained in Caroline County after the Battle of Fredericksburg. And after the war was over, she recalled having a conversation with the woman who enslaved her, because the woman who enslaved her essentially said following the Battle of Fredericksburg, the game's up, the war is over, you're not gonna win this thing. And Fanny, recognizing what had happened here at Fredericksburg, responded to her enslaver and said, isn't God the captain? He started this war and he's right out in front. He may stop in his career and let you rest up a little bit right now. Talking about the Battle of Fredericksburg, right? But our captain has never been beaten. Soon he'll start out again and you'll hear the bugle blow and he'll march on to victory. She went on to tell her enslaver, you all will be getting your pay for the way you've treated us poor black folks. We've been killed like dogs and the stripes you've laid on us hurt. But I am not going to run away. For I'm as certain this war will set us free as that I stand here. And I think, it's hard to recover the power of those words because, like I said, the Union war effort is going poorly in the East. People are wondering whether or not the federal government can actually win this thing. And the future of slavery and the institution of slavery, while the foundation is crumbling, right? To end slavery, you have to win the war. And here's Fanny looking at these events and going, I am certain that this war will set us free. And again, what wartime freedom would mean remained an open question. Wartime freedom and freedom after the war was over were completely different things. Those questions weren't resolved when the Emancipation Proclamation passed. They weren't resolved when the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery passed in 1865. They weren't resolved when the 14th Amendment passed establishing Black citizenship. But stories like that of Moses and Mildred Lucas remind us that while we can talk all we want about federal level command policies, all of these decisions, as Molly reminded us, had huge impacts on people's lives. These policies had human faces. They aren't just abstract ideas, they were lived realities. So this is part of the reason why we are so incredibly grateful to Molly for sharing her family's story with us. One of the things that I personally find so striking about Molly's family story is that we can see how the Lucas family answered these questions, right? We can see how they decided what freedom was going to look like, what they prioritized in their lives in the post-war era. And we can also see how the legacy of these questions and the inability of the United States to resolve these questions had impacts not just on those immediately after the war, but on generations of descendants from enslaved people. Right? In many ways, these questions, we're still wrestling with them. We're still deciding what their answers should look like. So on behalf of all of us here at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, I just want to thank you, Molly, for sharing your family's story with us. I'm trying really hard not to cry right now. I told Maddie earlier, I was like, I gotta bring tissues, and I didn't bring them, but thank you so much for letting us all learn from your journey. Most of all us here at the park, but also our wonderful public. So thank you all so much for coming out.